question was meant to be funny. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. It wasn't asked out of genuine curiosity or scientific interest or even hostility. It was asked as a joke. A way to embarrass the human sitting at the end of the table, to make the rest of the room laugh, remind everyone present exactly where humanity stood in the grand order of things. Nobody was laughing by the time he finished answering. If you're new here, welcome to HFY Universe, where we tell the stories of humanity that the rest of the galaxy wasn't ready for. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this one is going to stay with you. Let's go back to where it started. The Interspecies Academic Exchange Program had been running for just under 6 years when Sergeant Major Daren Cole was selected to represent humanity at the Galactic Military Studies Forum on Veth Prime. It wasn't a combat posting, even really a military assignment in any traditional sense. It was for all practical purposes a classroom. A very large, very alien classroom filled with cadets and officers from dozens of species across the known galaxy, all gathered to study military history, tactics, and the nature of warfare across civilizations. Prime itself was nothing like Earth. The sky was a pale green, the gravity slightly heavier than what Cole was used to, and the architecture of the forum's main campus was designed with species in mind that didn't move the way humans did: corridors too wide, ceilings too high, doorways shaped for bodies that came in configurations Cole's brain still occasionally struggled to process as natural. He'd been told to expect the disorientation. He'd been told it faded after a few days. It faded after about a week for him. He was stubborn that way. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for just over a decade at that point. Long enough to have made a few friends, long enough to have made a few enemies, but not long enough to have lost the reputation that followed them everywhere they went, the reputation of being, in the polite academic language of the forum, an unusually conflict-prone species with a disproportionate history of intraspecies violence. In less polite terms, humans had spent most of their history fighting each other, and the rest of the galaxy found that equal parts fascinating and unsettling. Cole had been briefed on all of this before he arrived. He knew what to expect: the curious looks, the careful distance, the questions that were technically polite but carried an edge underneath. He was a decorated veteran, 3 decades of service, the kind of soldier whose file made even human military brass raise an eyebrow. He'd been chosen for this assignment not because of what he'd done, but because of how he carried himself. Calm, measured, the kind of man who could sit in a room full of people who weren't sure what to make of him and make them feel, somehow, that everything was fine. He was good at that. Before he left for Veth Prime, a landing officer had pulled him aside for a conversation that wasn't in any official briefing document. She told him to expect 2 kinds of people at the forum: those who were genuinely curious about humanity, and those who had already made up their minds and were looking for confirmation. The first group, she said, was easy. Answer their questions honestly, show them you're a person and not a profile, and they'll walk away with something real. The second group was harder. They weren't looking for answers, they were looking for a reaction. Don't give them one, she said. Cole had nodded. He'd been dealing with that particular category of person his entire career. It wasn't specific to aliens. What he wasn't prepared for was Cadet Zeth. Zeth was a 4th-year cadet from the Calvari Collective, a species known in diplomatic circles for their sharp minds and sharper tongues. Among the cadets at the forum, had a reputation as the one who asked the questions nobody else wanted to ask, usually in the most public way possible, usually at someone else's expense. The session where it happened was a standard comparative military history lecture. The topic was combat efficiency metrics across species, a dry, academic subject that mostly involved charts, historical data, and a lot of terminology that made warfare sound like a mathematics problem. Cole had been invited to speak as a human military representative, sharing perspective on human combat doctrine. It had gone well up to that point. Cole spoke clearly, asked questions professionally, and navigated the subtle undercurrent of unease that always seemed to follow human representatives into these rooms with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years. Then Zeth raised his hand. "I have a question," Zeth said, in the careful, translated tone that the forum's communication system rendered perfect standard galactic. "For Sergeant Major Cole, a personal question if that is permitted." The session moderator nodded. Cole looked at Zeth. He'd dealt with cadets like this before, human ones anyway. He knew the look. The slight tilt of the head, glance to either side to make sure the audience was watching, the performance of someone about to say something they'd already rehearsed. "Of course," Cole said. Zeth smiled. "What is your personal kill count, Sergeant Major?" The room reacted immediately, a ripple of what passed for laughter among a dozen different species. Sounds and movements that Cole's experience told him were amusement. Several cadets exchanged glances. The question was designed to do exactly what it did: make the human uncomfortable, reduce a decorated soldier to a number, remind everyone in the room that humanity's relationship with violence was something to be observed from a safe distance. Like an animal in a case, Cole didn't react the way Zeth expected. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He didn't look uncomfortable at all. He just looked at Zeth for a moment, an expression that several attendees would later describe, independently of each other, as the look of a man deciding how honest to be. Then he reached into the document folder in front of him, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it flat on the table. "I thought someone might ask," he said quietly. I wrote it down. The laughter stopped, not all at once. It faded the way sound fades when something in the air changes and everyone in a room feels it before they understand why. Zeth's smile didn't disappear immediately either. It held for a second or two, uncertain now, no longer performing. Cole looked down at the paper. Then he began. He didn't read numbers. That was the first thing that surprised the room. He told stories. Each engagement, each conflict, each deployment, not as statistics, not as abstractions, but as events, places, moments. Collisions made in fractions of seconds under conditions that most of the cadets in that room had never come close to experiencing, even in simulation. He spoke about his first deployment, 2 weeks out of training, in a conflict that had nothing to do with aliens or galactic politics, just humans fighting other humans for a piece of land that both sides believed was theirs by right. He spoke about what it felt like to be 22 years old and responsible for the lives of the people next to you. He spoke without drama, without self-pity, without the kind of glorification that made war stories entertaining rather than true. He spoke about a medic named Torres who had saved 11 lives in a single engagement and never talked about it again. He spoke about a decision he'd made on the third day of a siege that he'd spent the next 20 years second-guessing, not because it was wrong, but because there had been no right answer, only the least bad one, on the weight of choosing it. He spoke about coming home and sitting in ordinary places, a kitchen, a park bench, a crowded street, and feeling like a visitor in a world that had kept moving while he'd been somewhere else entirely. He spoke about what soldiers owe the people they fight alongside, what they owe the people on the other side of the conflict, and how those two obligations sit together in a way that never fully resolves. He spoke about it not as philosophy, not as lecture, but as lived experience, the specific particular truth of a specific particular life. He spoke for 11 minutes. By the time he finished, the room was completely silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a speaker to conclude. The genuine silence of people who had stopped thinking about anything except what they'd just heard. Zeth hadn't moved. His earlier confidence was entirely gone, staring at Cole with an expression that, in Kelvari physiology, indicated something between shock and deep discomfort, not because the number had been large, though it had been larger than most in the room expected, but because of how Cole had talked about it like it mattered. Every single instance like it mattered. The senior moderator's a Vettian historian who had attended dozens of these forums over a long career later, wrote about what happened next in a paper that became, quietly, one of the most circulated documents in the forum's academic archive. She wrote, "What struck me was not the data, it was the weight. Every species represented in that room had military history, every species had conflicts, casualties, records of violence. But I had never in 30 years of academic work heard a soldier from any species speak about those records the way the human did. Not with pride. Not with shame, with weight, as if he had carried every single one of those moments with him every day for decades. As if the act of remembering was something he considered a personal obligation." She went on. Cadet Zeth asked the question to make the human seem dangerous. What he did not anticipate was that the human would make us understand something far more unsettling than danger. He made us understand what it costs. That paper was titled simply On the Nature of Human Soldiers. It was never officially added to the forum's curriculum. But for years afterward, cadets passed it to each other in the unofficial way that important things always travel in academic institutions quietly, without announcement. Because it said something that the official curriculum hadn't found a way to say yet. Cole left Veth Prime 3 days after the session. He didn't know about the paper. He didn't know that his 11-minute answer had become something people were still talking about months later. He flew home the same way he'd flown out, quietly, without ceremony, carrying the same folder he'd brought, the single sheet of paper folded back inside it. A junior diplomatic aide, who shared the transport back to the human embassy station, asked him, somewhere over the long stretch of transit between systems, if he'd known how the room would react. If he'd planned it. Cole thought about that for a moment. "I just answered the question," he said. The aide nodded slowly, not entirely satisfied with that answer. "But you wrote it down beforehand. You said you thought someone might ask." "Someone always asks," Cole said. He looked out at the stars outside the transport window for a moment. "I just make sure I remember the answer correctly." Back on Veth Prime, Zeth requested a transfer to a different study track 6 weeks after the session. The official reason listed was academic reorientation. Those who knew him said he'd stopped making the kinds of jokes he used to make. That he'd started spending more time in the forum's historical archive, reading human military records, not the tactical ones but the personal, memoirs, letters, accounts written by soldiers for no audience but themselves or the people they loved. Nobody asked him why. But the people who noticed said he always looked like someone trying to understand something that kept being larger than he expected. The story of what happened in that session spread the way these things do, slowly at first, then faster, lost between species, the way things get passed when they can't quite be explained but can't quite be forgotten either. The Vettian historian's paper helped. So did the testimony of the other cadets who'd been in the room, who kept being asked about it, and kept giving the same answer. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Like it mattered. Within a year, 3 separate academic institutions across 2 different star systems had formally requested human military representatives for their own exchange programs, not to study human tactics, not to analyze human weapons technology, but specifically to understand how human soldiers were trained to think about conflict. What values were embedded into the process? What kind of person came out the other side? The request surprised a lot of people in the human diplomatic corps. They had spent years managing the galaxy's unease about humanity's violent history, carefully framing the narrative, softening the edges. The idea that the unfiltered, unedited truth delivered by a tired veteran with a sheet of paper and 11 minutes had done more for human relations than a decade of careful diplomacy was, depending on who you asked, either deeply ironic or entirely predictable. Cole never knew about any of it. He was already on his next assignment by the time the requests came in. Another posting, another classroom, another room full of people trying to figure out what to make of the humans. He carried the same folder with him. The same sheet of paper, folded inside, because someone always asks, and he always makes sure he remembers the answer correctly, and that, more than any number on any sheet of paper, was what nobody in that room had been prepared for. They had expected to find, in Sergeant Major Daren Cole, evidence of everything they already believed about humans, that they were violent, that they were dangerous. But their history of conflict was something ancient and instinctive and maybe a little frightening. What they found instead was something harder to categorize. A man who had seen more of war than most of them would ever understand, who carried the memory of it like a responsibility, answered a question designed to diminish him with nothing more and nothing less than the complete unvarnished truth. There is a concept in human culture, older than most of humanity's written history, that the measure of a warrior is not found in how many battles they have won, but in how they remember the ones they have fought. In the weight they assign to what was lost, not just what was gained. In whether they come home changed, or whether they come home pretending they aren't. By that measure, Sergeant Major Daren Cole was one of the most formidable beings that had ever sat in that forum's lecture hall. Not because of the number on that sheet of paper, but because of what it clearly cost him to carry it. The galaxy had spent years trying to understand humanity by studying their weapons, their tactics, or history of conflict. What they kept missing, what that room full of cadets and officers finally, uncomfortably began to understand, was that the most important thing about human soldiers was never how hard they could fight. It was that they never forgot why it mattered. It was that every name, every decision, or moment lived inside them long after the conflict was not as a trophy, not as a wound, but as a debt. A permanent, unpayable debt to the reality of what war actually is, behind all the strategy and the doctrine, and the clean academic language of combat efficiency metrics. You cannot embarrass a person like that with a number. You cannot reduce them to a statistic, because they already know the statistic better than you do, and they've spent every day since living with the full weight of what it means. Veth had asked the question to get a reaction. What he got instead was an education, and somewhere, eyes that followed. It changed him, the same way it changed everyone else who had been in that room. Not into something fearful, not into something angry, into something more honest. The question was meant to be funny, nobody was laughing after. That's the story for today, and I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think the rest of the galaxy learned about humanity that day? Was it fear? Was it respect? Or was it something they still don't have a word for? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment. Some of you write things that genuinely make me want to build entire stories around them. If this video hit different for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Seriously, it takes 2 seconds and it means everything for a channel like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Stories drop every week on HFY Universe, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay human.